The dream ego, being the waking ego, transitioned with the self-concept, and then the self-image as the foci of the self-concept, and the complexes, all of them in their various taxa, when they appear in dreams, it's because they are obliged to, because of the associative strength of attachment to the ego. They can't escape it. And because they are conscious in and of themselves, then the implication must be that they actually experienced a dream too. It's not just the ego's dream. Any participant system is experiencing the dream. And what that means at a meta level is that the homeostatic regulation that is involved with the dream also refers to complexes. That's the natural state. That's the natural background state of regulating complexes. It seems that insofar as they are related to the ego, then they are drawn in and they are regulated, but also represented. Because if we have to do this using our Miller number and our daily adaptation to life, that's just contra naturam, and it's contra survival. You know, the ego is not meant to interfere with that process of natural regulation unless it does. But yeah, the Jungian idea that complexes all for dreams is the nonsense. It's an inflation. How the hell could they? They're only basically split off parts of the ego and its extended representation. It's not a big thing. A complex is not a big thing. It will be regulated. Therefore, it is being impelled and pulled into the dream narrative. Every bit as much. They experience the dream in the same way the waking ego does, as the dream ego.
Well, and that lends itself to what you said before very recently, that complexes will have a sense of autonomy within the dream too. They're actors who are obliged to write a script, but they also have some level of autonomy.
Yes.
And I suppose that explains why sometimes someone can have a complex dream. You know, thinking about in therapy, if something is going well, there'll be some kind of pushback, I guess. With these, I've been thinking a lot about your stuff recently with ego-identified complexes in dreams. And it seems from my own reflexivity that not all ego identified with complexes are pulled into every dream.
Oh.
It seems there's another consciousness, another intelligence that's orchestrating that to bring some of them in, and presumably that's going to be related to certain aspects of the self-concept of the person. But if someone's dealing with, and this isn't me referring to at the moment, I'm thinking more sort of generally, if someone's dealing with a clear problem, the unconscious knows that they're dealing with a problem and they're getting themselves neurotic, and the agent of that neurosis is an identified complex. Would we expect to see that complex appear more often than not in that person's dreams?
Yes, and this is important because when we reify or personify complexes and then expect to see them in that form, we might be disappointed when they don't appear in that form, or they are in compound representational states within the dream. So they're not always personified. They can be a situation, they can be a place, and some complexes that we think that aren't there will be peripherally there, or they will only be related to the dream preferentially by that regulatory process. So they're not little egos that have the complete structure of an individual ego with its own unconscious. They're not like that, but they are former ego states which are autonomous, and that autonomy means that they update and modify themselves and function. But that homeostatic regulatory principle will pull in those that are most important and through the most economical form of representation for them. But the personification is the insistence that comes from the dream ego in imitatio of the waking ego in personifying them. So if we see a character in a dream, it might be a borrowed image and we don't recognize it, but that might still be the complex, the specific situation and buildings, or the the geospatial aspect of the dreamscape. And then behind that, we'll see instincts. There's always instincts if you look in dreams. They're always there. So all of that's going on. So the way that they appear may not be obvious. And if we insist on the reification, then we're going to miss it.
Yeah. If the dream ego expects them to be, or not dream ego, the waking ego expects them to be characters, I imagine you'd likely get that mirrored back over a deep structure complex, instead mocking almost the ego.
Yeah, and you're right also about the autonomy of complexes within dreams. To some extent, they have to have their autonomy because they're still functional units. And most complexes, even if they're unpleasant to experience, and we have to be careful because this is a seductive suggestion if we're not careful, they have their use. And if the mopping up process of homeostasis is too stringent, it would be like eliminating aspects of our own immune capacity. So they have to be kept to some extent. And also one complex can be in several states or representations within a dream, or several complexes could coalesce into a scenario, a sub-scenario within the wider narrative. All of that, which suggests complexity. But then we have to, of course, appreciate that the representation of the dream narrative, although it's wider, it's more qualitatively different to the external Miller number, but it's still limited.
Yep.
So all of this is going on at the same time.
I think Yulia asked you on a seminar fairly recently about aligned complexes, and I wasn't there at the time, but I think you said that they can appear in dreams, but they're not as common to show up. And presumably non-aligned, not really. There's no reason for them to
Yeah, there's almost no way of deducing whether we're experiencing a non-aligned complex, because by its nature it is relatively unconscious. So there's no direct observation of them, I would suggest, except where you get things that might be, a prompt, like a non-aligned complex then will be anonymous, we can say, because it's unconscious, but its representation might be in the form of a novel representation, an unknown character, which might be mistaken for being the shadow or something like that, or even the self. And those non-aligned complexes, where they're active, may be so because there is still a connection to an aligned or an identified with one in a kind of a web of association. So we might see them as just sundry characters or something that drifts in and drifts through. It was not particularly associated to the dream ego. The most, I would say, in theory, the most prominent ones will be identified with, and they will be set against instincts.
Yeah. Yeah, it does make sense.
And we'll also get the deep structure complexes as well active,
because
that's part of the homeostatic regulation. So we'll get deep structure reflecting back to us. The waking egos collapse into itself, but from the perspective experientially of the dream ego, the deep structure ego will perform the same function. And that one might then be represented, for example, as a disappointment, because the deep structure complex is saying, I am not real. This is what you believe. You think this will solve the problem. Well, here I am, and it's not worked. And here I am as a rarefied representation, or as a scenario which collapses, fails. And then we know there's something wrong because there isn't an instinct in that primary sense pushing through.
Yeah.
To bring what Freud would have understood as gratification. So there's no pancept there necessarily. There might be a lot of frustration. So there's all of these things to consider if we're getting really deep into it. Most people don't need to think about these things in that way, when they do dream work, but I think they should.
Yeah, hearing you speak there, for me and for the students, it would be amazing if there was some supply of anonymous dreams from somewhere that every so often you could interpret, because each time you have done a dream, because the most recent I think you've done was the train and the guy shooting up the train. They're very useful for picking out what dream symbols might be more universally for then use away from the case study. That when you spoke on the Scooby-Doo one a few years ago, that was amazing to see that Scooby-Doo was sort of instinct and Shaggy was like an immature ego, and even the language that Scooby had was an issue of communication between the instincts and the ego. And it's like, that's so useful to know. But I'm really sad about this, that dream videos don't do well on Jung to Live By.
No, they don't, do they?
I thought people would love dreams.
Yeah, I think part of the problem might be that people probably think they know what a dream analysis should be like. They think it's simple, and all you have to do is know what the various Jungian structures are, and then it's all done.
Yeah.
Whereas that's a deep structure complex in and of itself, really.